Okay, so one of the biggest topics as part of the number section of the curriculum is fractions, decimals, and percentages. If I go through every single thing to do with fractions, decimals, percentages all in one video, it'll probably be at least an hour long, so I don't want to do that. So I'm going to split it up into 3 different bits: fractions, then decimals, then percentages, and do all the things related to those topics. But this video is going to be about converting between the 3 and then putting them in some kind of order. And so what do I mean by converting? Well, we're going to look at this triangle here. Anyone who's been in a class with me before is probably familiar with this triangle. This is the triangle we use to convert between a fraction, a decimal, and a percentage. So let's take the fraction 3/5 as an example. Well, if I want to make it into a decimal, what I need to do is do the division. I need to do 3 divided by 5. So in this case, it's 3 divided by 5. And so if I do 3 divided by 5, I'm going to get 3 here, 5 here. This is my bus stop method. Other methods are available. Please use the one that you feel more comfortable with. 5s into 3 doesn't go, so I'm going to put a decimal point here because I know that I've run out of numbers. I place a 0 here, and so I've got the number 30. 5s into 30 goes 6, and so what I've ended up with is the decimal 0.6. And that's my decimal. To get from a decimal to a percentage, at this point we multiply by 100 if we're going leftwards. And if we're going rightwards, we would divide by 100. So we'll bear that in mind, but we're going leftwards. So we're going to times 100. This is where our knowledge of place value will be really helpful. And there is a video, or there will be soon, about place value. And so if you're not sure about what I mean, please have a look at that. 0.6, if we look at place value and we multiply by 100, what we're going to do is move our number 2 to the left. And so if I get rid of this dot real quick and then place another dot in the middle where it's separate, I'm going to take this 0 and I'm going to take the zeros, and so I'm going to move them 2 to the left. So what we do is we don't move the dot, but we have to imagine all of our dots are all of our numbers are bolted together. And so I'm going to move it to the left once, move it to the left twice. And what I get is 60.0. We don't need the 0.0 at the end. And so what we actually have is the number 60. And our percentage is 60. That might seem quite simple, but knowing how to times and divide by tens, hundreds, and thousands is really important for this sort of conversion because it saves us a lot of time. To get from a percentage to a fraction again, we know that it's going to end up at 3/5, but how do we get there? Well, the word percent actually means out of 100. And so if we know that percentage means out of 100, we can take our number, which is 60, put it out of 100, and this is a fraction equivalent to 60%. However, we have to simplify our fraction. And how can we do that? Well, they both end in 0, so we can take 1 0 off of both. That's 6 out of 10. Then we can divide them both by 2 because they're both even numbers. And so we half them both and we get 3 and 5. And so what we're going to do to get from a percentage to a fraction in words is we're going to simplify fraction. We're going to simplify our fraction after we turn it into something out of 100. And so that's going to be our answer. Going back the other way, we can do it as well. I'm going to copy this triangle and put it on another sheet so that we can see that. So I'll see you in just a second. Okay, and so if we're going to go the other way, ignore the arrows, these are just the way they work. If we're going this way, we want to get from a fraction to a percentage. We need to put fraction over 100, which means make the bottom number 100 and work out what's going to go on the top. And as soon as we do that, we'll have our percentage. So to do this, how many 25s go into 100? Well, there are 4 25s in 100. So 7 times by 4 is 28. So my percentage is going to be 28%. And so what I've ended up with is if I made it a bigger fraction, I expand the fraction, we're going to get 28 out of 100. And as soon as you get something out of 100, we know percent means out of 100. And so the top number is our percentage, which is 28%. Now, this won't always be possible because your bottom number or your denominator won't always go nicely into 100. But if it does, it's much easier to make it into a percentage than it is to make it into a decimal. So, as I put in the other slide, when we're going rightwards, we're going to be dividing by 100. So if we're going rightwards from a percentage to a decimal, we're going to divide this number by 100. So similar to before, when we divide by 100, I'm going to make sure this is all one separate piece. I'm going to make my dot red just to really make it stand out. I've got my 28. Dividing by 100 means moving it as many places as there are zeros. There are 2 zeros, so I'm going to move it right twice. So we go 1 and 2, and then end up with 0.28. Obviously, I'm going to put the 0 in front of it because that's just good methodology, good way of doing it. And so what we end up with is the decimal 0.28. To get back from a decimal to a fraction, we have to know a certain amount of things about place value. If we consider our 0.28 here, what places have we actually got here? Well, starting here we have units. Well, what's to the right of units? That's our tenths column. And to the right of that is our hundredths column. And so what we've got is, if we have 2 decimal numbers after our point, we're going to have something out of 100. And so we can start, again, with our fraction as 28 out of 100. And so, again, we've ended up with this, and now we can simplify, going back to our fraction, by dividing both numbers by 4. And we're going to end back up with 7 out of 25, which is going to be my answer. And so just doing this with a different number, because it won't always be so nice, let's say we do something that's going to end up with like this. I'm going to change it. I'm going to start with a decimal. I'm going to start with 0.375. Some of you may actually know what this is off by heart, but if you don't, let me show you how we work it out. First thing we do, I'm going to go to a percentage. So what do we do when we go to a percentage? Well, when we go leftwards, we multiply by 100. So we're going to multiply this number by 100. If I do that, I can imagine moving my number 2 to the left. 1, 2. This is going to be 37 and 0.5. So my percentage is 37.5%. And that's okay. You can have decimals in your percentages. That's fine. What isn't fine is having decimals in my fractions. So there are 2 ways we could do this. Both ways end up with the same starting point, but let me show you both. We know that 37.5 as a percent means 37.5 out of 100. However, we don't have, or we don't like to have, decimals in our fractions. So we need to get rid of that somehow. Well, how can I get rid of that? If I move my number 1 more to the left, what I'm going to end up with, it might have been right on the camera because it's flipped around, we're going to end up with 375 because I've times it by 10. So it's 375. What I do to the top, I have to do to the bottom. And that means that we're going to have 375 out of 1000 as the starting point for my fraction. And then I can simplify it from there, which I will do in just a second. Coming back from the other way, when I said, let's use our place value to work out what it needs to start at. Well, if we take our number 0.375, what places have I got? Well, I've got a units, I've got a tenths, I've got a hundredths, but I've also got a thousandths. And as soon as I've got a thousandth column, I know that my bottom number is going to be 1000. And then I just take the number that's after the dot, in this case 375, and put it over 1000. Similarly, if this was 0.6, I know I'm going to have something out of 10 because there's only a tenths column here. But that's besides the point. Either way, we're going to end up with a 375 out of 1000. What do I do to simplify this? Well, I know that they both end in either 5 or 0, and so I can simplify this by dividing them both by 5. 1000 divided by 5 is 200, so that's going to be the bottom number there. 375 divided by 5 is 75, and how I know that is if I split this into 300 and 75, 300 over 5 is 60, and 75 over 5 is 15, add them together and I get 75 out of 200. Splitting it again, because we've still got a 5 and a 0, so we can divide them both by 5 again. I just told you that's going to be 15. 200 again would be 40, but we see it still ends in a 5 and a 0. So we can divide them by 5 again. So that's going to be 3 out of 8 as our final answer. And so our final answer as a fraction is 3/8. Now, You might be able to see a faster way of doing this. For example, we could go in 75 straight away and end up with 5 out of 8 immediately, or 15s. But we can't, if you can't do that, that's fine. Just do it in stages, and that's perfectly fine as long as you end up with the simplest answer of 3 out of 8 for that kind of question. And this triangle should be ingrained into your mind because this is the perfect explanation for how to get from fractions to decimals to percentages over and over again. So that's how we're going to do that. Okay, so here's an example question of an equivalent question. What are the decimal and percentage equivalents to 13 out of 20? Well, let's have a think about that. First, I'm going to make it a percentage. Well, what does percentage mean? It means something out of 100. So I know I'm going to have something out of 100. Times everything by 5 to get to 100, because there's 5 20s and 100. 5 13s is 65. And so I've got 65 out of 100, which I can change to 65%. And so that's going to be my percentage for this. My decimal amount, therefore, once I've got a percentage, I divide it by 100. And so what I end up with is 0.65. And so these are my decimal and percentage equivalents to 13 out of 20. And that would be my answer. So that's essentially how we work out a decimal and percentage equivalent. And I'm using my triangle in my brain. If you need to write it down, write it down. Draw the triangle, work out how to get from one to the other. That's perfectly fine. Here's an example practice question for you to try. And it says, what is the fraction and decimal equivalent of 17.5%? So have a pause, have a go, refer back to the triangle if you need to. It's completely fine. Give it a go, and I'll see you in just a few seconds. Okay, so we know that we are going to have a decimal in our fraction first of all. I'm going to make it a fraction first. So I'm going to have 17.5 out of 100, which I told you was a no-go. We can't have that. So what instead if we had 175 out of 1,000? I've multiplied both numbers by 10. Okay, then I see that both end in a 5 or 0, so I'm going to divide them both by 5. If we divide these both by 5, I'm going to have 35, and I'm going to have 200. And then if I simplify this again by 5 again, because again they end in 5 and 0, we're going to have 7, and we're going to have 40. Okay, so that's going to be my fraction. It's going to be 7 out of 40. The decimal equivalent is going to be this divided by 100. So I move it 2 places to the right. I'm going to get 0.175. And that is my decimal equivalent. Just to show you that that is indeed the answer. 7 divided by 40 is 0.175. So these are all equivalent to one another. And so very well done if you managed to get 7 out of 40 and 0.175. This is a slightly harder question, but this is the sort of thing they can ask you where the percentage has a decimal inside of it. So be careful about that. And that's really all there is to know about converting between one or the other. Where that's used is when we have to compare them to each other. So they may say something like, compare these fractions in terms of size, or, you know, here's some deal, who's got the better deal in terms of a percentage or something like that. And we have to compare them. Unlike fractions, decimals, and percentage questions where that's all you get, when you get given a mixture of all three, you can pick whichever one you want to answer the question. So in this example here, I'm going to say, can convert to any of FDP. You can convert to any of them. You can pick whichever one you want, you'll feel more comfortable with. I've been doing all these without a calculator. And so we'll do this one without a calculator. And when I get you the question to do, try and do that without a calculator as well. Here's how we're going to do this. I'm probably going to pick decimals for this. These numbers seem quite nice. The hardest one being 0.32, so I don't want to mess with that. I'm going to leave that as a decimal. So underneath, I'm going to write what these are as decimals. A half is 0.5. We should recognize that one by sight. 0.32 is already a decimal, so that stays the same. 3/4 is another one we should recognize by sight, is 0.75. And if I divide this by 100, I get 0.65. And so these are my 4 answers. Now all I've got to do is rewrite them in the right order. So this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, and this is number 4. To answer the question though, we have to put them back in the order that they gave us and in the form that they gave us. And some people do forget that. So this has got to be 0.32, then it's got to be a half, then it's got to be 65%, and then it's got to be 3/4. So your answer should look like this. They should look in the same way that they gave them to you. Even if you converted them all to decimals, put them back into their right form or their original form to actually answer the question. And so that would be my answer to this question. So let's do another example. They say place the following in order of size from smallest to biggest, and they do have to specify what order they want you to put them in. They might say ascending or descending order, which are maths words you need to recognize, but I'm going to be a bit more kind and say from smallest to biggest. So let's do this together. This time I'm going to make them all percentages. Why not? So we've got 7 out of 20. How many 20s in 100? Well, 20 times by 5 is 100. So we're going to write that down. 20 times by 5 equals 100. What I do to one side, I must do to the other. So what we end up with is something out of 100. 7 5s is 35. So what we end up with is 35%. And I can remove my fraction part. If you write these in pencil, it will help you because you can then rub out stuff that you don't need. 34% is already in a percentage, so I'm going to leave that as 34%. 0.28 when I multiply by 100 is 28%. And 4 out of 10, 10 tens is 100, so 4 tens is 40. And so what I'm going to end up with is 40% here. Now, put them in order, so I label which ones is which. This is number 1, this is going to be number 2, then number 3, then number 4. And so my answer is 0.28. I'm going to type these because my writing is not so good with the mouse. 0.28, 34%. Then it's going to be 7 out of 20. And then it's going to be 4 out of 10. And that will be my answer. So that's, again, the sort of thing that we are looking for. We're looking for our answers to be in the same form that they gave us the questions. So here you go. Here's one to practice. Place the following in order of size from biggest to smallest. So be careful, I flipped the script on you a little bit. Place them in order from biggest to smallest. Pause the video, have a go, and I'll be back in just a second to see how you got on. Okay, so if you used a calculator, probably the easiest way of doing this would be to make them all into decimals. But since I asked for you to not do it with a calculator, I'm going to do it without one as well. So I'm going to make these all into decimals, but I'm not going to actually use a calculator to do it. I'm going to leave this as a decimal, so this is 0.502, and leave that the same. This one I can divide by 100, so what I end up with is 0.456. This one, I've got to make something out of 100 and then divide it by 100. So this will be 42 out of 100 because I've halved both numbers. 42 divided by 100 is 0.42. So that is my answer there. This divided by 100 is 0.419. Okay, and so what we've got is that this is this is biggest to smallest, so even I almost fell into the trap. This is number 1, then this is number 2, then this is number 3, and this is number 4. Well, would you look at that? I've put them in the right order for you just to begin with, and sometimes that can happen. It's not very common, but sometimes that can happen. So don't be alarmed if, hang on, that's just the order they gave them to me in. Sometimes that is the case. And so what we would do is we'd rewrite these as my answers underneath. So I'll move these up a second, then I'm going to write them back out. So it's a bit redundant, but you do have to do this. So it'll be 45.6%, then it'll be 84 out of 200, and then it'll be 41.9%. Like that. And so that will be my answer. Very good job if you managed to get that correct. If not, go back through the video again, have a look at the triangle, make sure you understand how we convert between one to the other to the other. Yes, thanks for watching, and see you in just a bit for the bigger videos on each specific part of fractions, decimals, and percentages. See you then.